Welcome to Apologetic Showdown. I'm here with Randall Rauser and Ben Watkins for a Devil's Advocate debate. So they're going to be taking the opposite of the positions that they actually hold on the existence of God. And this should be a really interesting discussion. So the format's going to be, it's going to be 10-minute statements, then 5-minute rebuttals, and then 30-minute open dialogue, and then time for deconstruction where they'll break out of character. And then if we have time, we'll do a little bit of Q&A at the end if there are questions. So I have posted the links to their channels in the description. And if you guys want to introduce yourself or say anything real quick, you can, and then we'll go ahead and start.
Randall, do you want to start?
Oh, sure. I'd love to start. So I'm Randall, and I'm a professor in Canada and teaching in a seminary for the last 18 years. I've written 11 books, 3 of them co-authored, 2 of them with atheists. Do a lot of apologetics because I enjoy it, and I'm happy to be here.
My name's Benjamin Watkins, and I'm one of the hosts of Real Atheology, a Philosophy of Religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from an atheological point of view and attempt to see what we can salvage from our religious concepts to see what religion could possibly look like in the future.
All right. And Ben's going to go first. So I know you have a slideshow. So yeah, let's get that up and then I'll start the clock.
Alrighty.
All right, I'm going to start the clock now.
Okay, so I take the central question of tonight's discussion to be, does God exist? This is a fundamental question in the philosophy of religion, but before we can see if reason and evidence can come to bear on this question, we must first be clear about the concept of God, or what we mean by the term God. So for tonight's discussion, I'll be using the common Western conception of monotheism, or perfect being theism. According to this view, God is a singular, perfect, and personal being, always worthy of our worship. God has the essential divine properties of being omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and perfectly loving. This concept has been expressed in phrases like the greatest conceivable being, or a maximally great being, or a being that none greater can be conceived. And so, on this view, God is the deepest metaphysical fact about existence and the deepest good realizable by finite creatures. He is the creator and sustainer of the natural world, but is also distinct from it, someone in whom we could have an eternally meaningful relationship with, and is the central divinity described in Christian, Islamic, and Jewish traditions. So, now that we have a working concept of God, I want to turn my attention to the affirmative answer of the question of God's existence, or theism. And I'll present at least 2 arguments tonight that I find interesting and worth serious consideration. The first argument is a cosmological argument, and the second is an argument from design. My first argument is a variation of the argument from contingency, and my second we can call the argument from moral agency. First up is the argument from contingency. So, the argument from contingency. The main question that I want to center in on this discussion is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything at all? Why this something instead of something else? Cosmological arguments are one attempt to answer these questions. According to the argument from contingency, the universe must have an explanation because the universe is contingent or could have failed to exist. And it must have an explanation that is not merely another contingent thing, but rather something necessary. If we concede the universe has always existed, it still must depend on something necessary. And that necessary thing is a perfect being or God. So as you can see on the screen, the general form of argument is that the universe is a contingent thing and is the set of all other contingent things. And any contingent thing must depend on something other than itself. Therefore, we can infer the universe must depend on something other than itself. And whatever the universe depends on must be necessary. And that necessary thing is a perfect being. And so from these premises, we can infer that a perfect being exists. And obviously, if a perfect being exists, then God exists. Now, I have some things to highlight here. So the first is the concepts of necessity and contingency. So if something is necessary, then it could not fail to exist. If something is contingent, then it could fail to exist. If something is self-existent, then it is something whose existence is accounted for by its own nature. If something is dependent, then it is something whose existence is accounted for by something else. Every possible world is one in which God creates a universe. So it was metaphysically impossible for there to be a complete absence of anything. There is something because there had to be. The second concept that I want to highlight here is the principle of sufficient reason, or the PSR. And so this principle states that either the universe depends on something else for its existence, or it does not. A universe consisting of only contingent things must depend on something else, because a purely contingent reality cannot account for its own actual existence. If something cannot fail to exist, then the part of reality that includes all contingent things depends on something necessary. And so at this point in the argument, it might be noticed that this argument doesn't tell us anything about the moral properties of a God. So this argument is not going to get us there. We're going to need some other argument to help us bridge this gap. So I now want to turn my attention to my second argument, which is the argument for moral agency, to see if we can try to get some of these moral properties. So, the argument for moral agency. Arguments from design or teleological arguments infer the existence of God from observed goal-directedness in nature, or so some observation is said to obtain because God wanted or intended for it to obtain. We'll let naturalism be the hypothesis the universe is causally closed system and there is nothing supernatural. And theism will be the hypothesis there is a perfect and personal being who created the universe with a goal-directed purpose. According to the argument for moral agency, there are moral agents that can make morally significant decisions. Such moral agents are much more likely on theism than on naturalism. Therefore, we can infer through a likelihood evaluation that theism is likely true and naturalism is likely false, other things being equal. So the first concept that I want to unpack here is the concept of a moral agent making morally significant decisions in a moral arena. So obviously the datum that we're trying to use here is that moral agents exist. A moral agent is a sentient being that has intrinsic moral value or moral worth and moral responsibilities, or the ability to recognize moral obligations and make morally significant choices. And so now I want to say a couple things about the likelihood evaluation. The intrinsic moral value of moral agents does not raise the probability of their existence on naturalism, because a mechanistic view of the natural world is indifferent to the value of agency, and so has neither the means nor the motives to select for the evolution of beings with intrinsic moral value. If moral agency and moral responsibility imply incompatibilism or a libertarian view of free will, then this is even more unlikely given naturalism. If theism is true, then God, who has both the means and motives to create creatures with intrinsic moral value, moral responsibility, and libertarian free will. According to the recently discovered fine-tuning data, only a small proportion of the range of possible values that certain cosmic constants could have had would be life permitting, and only a small proportion of the possible initial conditions they could have attained would be life permitting. Thus, the likelihood of life, much less moral agency, given naturalism, is extremely low. And finally, moral agency also requires moral cognition. That in turn requires consciousness or conscious mental states. And conscious mental states are more likely on theism than on naturalism, because theism implies the existence of at least one conscious mental state, namely God's infinite conscious mind. So according to the law of likelihood, we can say that an observation favors a hypothesis over another if the probability of that datum is more likely on that hypothesis than the other. And so in this situation, we're just going, the value of X, we're going to let it be intrinsic moral value, libertarian free will, the fine-tuning data, and conscious mental states. And the claim that I want to make is that all of these are more likely on theism than on naturalism. So, in conclusion, my arguments have been deliberate in the sense that my target is metaphysical naturalism. The argument from contingency was a deductive argument from the conclusion the universe depends on something else, and this something else is necessary and might be non-natural or supernatural. The second argument was an inductive argument for the conclusion there is a perfect being who intends our universe to be a certain way. There are two unique challenges to naturalism here, because they challenge it using different considerations and different methods, yet come to similar conclusions. Perhaps these two arguments are climbing the same mountain, but from different sides, and will arrive at the same peak, where our peak will be a metaphor for the conclusion that naturalism is false and theism is true. And so that's my devil's advocate presentation defense of theism.
All right, thank you for that. All right. Randall, if you want to go ahead and go, I'm going to start the clock now.
All right, I'd like to thank Ben of Relay Theology for being my opponent tonight, and Dry Apologist for hosting this debate. Now, I've committed to defending the view that God does not exist, but as with many things, we should begin with definitions. I appreciate Ben doing so. I'm going to do so as well. So for the purposes of this debate, I'm going to understand God to be a person who is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good. A lot of overlap there with what Ben said. Now, as we all know, theists are infamous for treating their definition of God as endlessly malleable, refute one definition, and they quickly retreat to another. This, of course, leads the skeptic into the impossible situation of attempting to nail the proverbial jello to the wall. Well, the way we escape that sorry scene is by refusing to compromise. So, for God to exist will mean that a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good exists. And that means that if one of those properties is not exemplified plausibly by some putative being, then God does not exist. There still could be some other being, perhaps an omnipotent being who is somewhat good, or an all-knowing being who is somewhat powerful. But whatever that being would be, it would not be God. To put it another way, for Ben to make his case tonight, he must show that a being with these three properties, omnipotence, omniscience, and perfect goodness, exists. I only have to show that there is no evidence for a being with those three properties. Now, you might think I'm stacking the deck in some way, but I assure you I'm not. The core idea of God just is the idea of a being who is the ultimate standard for power, knowledge, and goodness, or as Ben said, perfect being, and thus the proper maximal object of worship. For a being to be God, that being must have these properties. Think of omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection as the three legs of a stool. If I knock out just one of those legs, the entire stool collapses, and so it is with the concept of God. Now, in my argument, I will take a somewhat conventional, well-worn path by focusing my efforts on the problem of evil, one in which we move from the existence of evil and suffering to the non-existence of God. Now, I'm a product of the 1980s, and one of my favorite bands of that era was Survivor. We all know Survivor as the Eye of the Tiger band, and that is incidentally a great song to begin a debate. But they also had a very fine ballad titled The Search is Over. And in that song, the singer reflects on the fact that he had long been looking for the perfect woman until he finally realized that she was always with him. The search is over. You were with me all the while. I want to argue something like that. We can search for all sorts of arguments for or against God's existence. But if we stop and simply pay attention to the evidential weight of the suffering and evil in the world, I believe we too will find that the search is over. The answer was with us all the while. Now, to appreciate this point, we need to make an important distinction between being unable to see how something can be true and being able to see that something cannot be true. In our case, we will distinguish between A, being unable to see how God can exist in light of evil, versus B, being able to see that God cannot exist in light of evil. I hope you can appreciate that there is a world of difference between these two positions. You see, the theist clearly wants to go with A. They may not be able to see how evil can be reconciled to God's existence, but they believe it must be. They might reason like this. Premise 1, I am unable to see how God can exist in light of evil. However, premise 2, the fact that I cannot see how God can exist in light of evil does not mean God cannot exist in light of evil, because there may be ways to reconcile the existence of God with evil that are unknown to me. Therefore, 3, I am reasonable to believe that God exists even though I cannot see how God can exist in light of evil. But everything changes if we become convinced that the weight of evidence supports not merely the milquetoast judgment of A, but rather the robust judgment of B. I am able to see how God cannot exist in light of evil. If we become convinced that the weight of evidence supports B, then atheism wins. Everything rests on convincing you that it is not merely the case that we are unable to see how God can exist in light of evil, but rather that we are able to see that God cannot exist in light of evil. If I convince you of this, then game over. I have knocked out one of the legs of the stool and God does not exist. So why not conclude that the theist is right, as in the argument above? Why not conclude that human knowledge is limited and it is always possible that God has reasons that we cannot imagine? Well, I admit you can go that route if you want. You can even say that 2 plus 2 seems to equal 4, but for all we know, it might equal 5. After all, God might have a reason for allowing a Cartesian demon to deceive us about the basic truths of math and logic. By that score, it may even be that we're all wrong about the very existence of evil in the first place. Perhaps evil and suffering really are just more examples of moral good, so that we have moral good of love and kindness and the moral good of evil and cruelty. Maybe there is no problem of evil at all. I mean, why not? If you want to play a game of mere possibilities, you can always hive out a winner's circle, however meager it may be. But the pertinent question is not what is merely possible in the broadest logical sense. Rather, it is what is most plausible in light of evidence and experience. And when we consider the distribution and intensity of evil in our world, by far the more plausible analysis is that we can see that it cannot be reconciled with God's existence. Since evil clearly does exist, it follows that God does not. To see why, we only need consider a tiny sampling of the moral horrors that make up our world. Consider this account from Romeo Dallaire, head of UN peacekeeping forces in Rwanda during the 1994 genocide. He writes, across the street from the mission, an entire alleyway was littered with the bodies of women and children near a hastily abandoned school. Brent and Stefan decided to head for the church. They confronted a scene of unbelievable horror, the first such scene Unimer witnessed, evidence of the genocide, though we did not yet know to call it that. In the aisles and on the pews were the bodies of hundreds of men, women, and children. At least 15 of them were still alive, but in a terrible state. A baby cried as it tried to feed on the breast of its dead mother. Now, that was but one scene UN peacekeeping forces witnessed, the first of a litany of unbelievable carnage as 800,000 people were hacked to pieces one by one. Women and children tortured and raped, skeletons unearthed with all manner of horrific implements jammed into the bones of their pelvis. We cannot begin to imagine the agony of these deaths. and God stood silently by. Was he constrained by his desire for the Hutus to have the free will to kill? Did another mysterious greater good keep him from acting? Or should we talk about the Bosnian genocide? For example, a Muslim mother who was raped repeatedly in front of her father and newborn. And when she asked her captors if she might breastfeed her crying infant, one of them beheaded the child and threw the head in her lap. Shall we talk about the horrors of Cambodia, Indonesia, Nazi Germany? Elie Wiesel wrote of his time in a Nazi concentration camp. He saw a young child being hanged, but he was so light that the child flailed about on the end of the rope for minute after minute. Where is God? A rabbi whispered. Wiesel answered to himself, he is hanging there on the gallows. Indeed. So ask yourself, honestly, is it simply the case that you cannot see how God could allow all this pain and suffering, agony and horror, but he does have his reasons? Right. And maybe 2 + 2 = 5. You know, Kevin Carter was a Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist who took the 1993 photo called The Vulture and Little Girl. It depicts a starving child collapsed a half-mile from a feeding station in South Sudan when a vulture looking on, waiting for death to take her. Mr. Carter committed suicide about a year after that photo was taken, worn down by years of encountering endless misery. This is from his suicide note. The pain of life overrides the joy to the point that joy does not exist. As a photojournalist who had worked in the darkest recesses of humanity, Mr. Carter could see with horrifying lucidity that which I am asking you to grapple with right now. The theist is wrong. The truth is that we can see that God cannot exist in light of evil. For all we know, some being may exist, but that being most surely is not God. If we want to settle the question of God's existence, we need only open our eyes to the evil that unfolds around us every day. We only need to recognize that the pain of life truly does override the joy. And when we realize that, we will see the search is over. The truth was with us all the while. And that truth is that we are alone. God does not exist.
All right. Thank you for that, Randall. Ben, go ahead with your 5-minute rebuttal, starting now.
Sorry, hang on, let me pull this
Okay,
up.
sure.
Okay, so one of the responses that I want to give to the problem of evil is what is known as a theodicy. And this theodicy is called the soul-building theodicy. So as Randall outlined for us just a few minutes ago, the problem of evil implies that God is incompatible with unjustified evils. If there are any unjustified evils, then there is no God. One solution to the problem of evil is that evil is actually justified because God designed the world to be a moral arena where people's significantly free choices, their consequences, and firsthand experiences of natural evils are necessary to develop moral and spiritual growth for a relationship with God. According to the soul-building theodicy, our world is the best of all possible worlds, and what matters most in a moral sense is how we respond to events in this lifetime rather than what happens to us in this lifetime. If we view evil as a problem because it seems unjustified, then that is because we would mistakenly think the world should be more like a hedonistic paradise in this lifetime. So theodicies, let me say something on theodicy real quick. All parties to this discussion can concede the existence of evil, and theodicies attempt to explain why God is either not morally responsible for creating evil or not morally blameworthy for creating it. So one of the things that I want to turn my attention to that I need to say something about is horrendous evils. According to the dualism of practical reason, our own happiness often comes into conflict with our moral responsibilities. If our lives are to be conducive to both morality and happiness, then we need some explanation for this congruence. The soul-building theodicy claims that what matters most are our responses to events in this lifetime. But young children have no opportunity to respond to events, and some people suffer so horrendously in this world that they lose themselves entirely. Their experiences of suffering are at least in some sense soul-destroying, and Randall highlighted some of those in his opening statement. Congruence between happiness and morality might be achieved, though, if there is a universal afterlife. So, I will argue if there is no universal afterlife, then morality and human happiness would be in conflict. Morality and human happiness are not in conflict on the soul building theodicy. Therefore, the soul building theodicy implies a universal afterlife. Non human animals are something else I need to say something about. Non human animals languish in the state of nature's struggle for survival. The soul building theodicy assumes there are moral agents, but non human animals are moral patients. Because what matters in this lifetime is how agents respond to events, non human animals do not have opportunities for character development nor meaningful relationship with God. One solution to this worry is that God does not have any uniquely moral obligations to mere moral patients in this world. Moral patients may languish in the state of nature in this lifetime, but there may be a universal hedonistic paradise for non-human animals too. It might be the case that all dogs really do go to heaven. The last thing I want to say is something about skeptical theism. Skeptical theism insists that, given the epistemic distance between us and a perfect being like God, we should be skeptical of an inference from inscrutable evils to unjustified evils, because God justifying reasons for allowing them would likely be obscure or beyond our ken. Some inscrutable evil may be necessary for a greater good, or to prevent some evil equally bad or worse. So we should remain skeptical of claims that human beings can discern God justifying reasons for the evils we observe. Skeptical theists argue that facts about evil do not count as evidence, or at least not that much evidence, against theism. And so what I want to appeal to today is, first, before I do that, I should explain what an inscrutable evil is. So the argument from evil claims inscrutable evils, or evils we know of no God-justifying reason for allowing, are evidence against theism. One strategy insists there is a principle that is not satisfied in the case of evil and theism. I'll call this principle the conditions of reasonable epistemic access, or cornea. This principle claims that given the epistemic distance there would be between us and a perfect being, we can only claim it appears there are any unjustified evils if it is reasonable to believe that there were no unjustified evils. Then the world would likely be different than it is in some discernible way to us. So the idea behind this is that God justifying reasons for evils will not be transparent, but rather obscure. And we can defend this by using an analogy with a parent. Small children are in the dark about our reasons for allowing them to suffer justified pain. So we should expect we are similarly in the dark about God justifying reasons for allowing.
Then you got to wrap it up because
I'm done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, it's fine. All right. Randall, when you start, I'll start the timer.
All right. Well, thanks again. This is a lot of fun. I'm going to put on my ball cap because now I mean business. Okay, so Ben talked about soul building theodicy. That's fine if we're talking about the dynamic of like a gymnasium where the trainer's getting you to work hard, but this is not a gymnasium. What we're talking about here is a torture chamber, a context in which many people are absolutely destroyed by the evils they experience. That is not what you would expect. That is not what you would anticipate if a perfect being was allowing some degree of suffering in order to bring about moral growth in agents. Ben talked about this as the best of all possible worlds, and I would submit that any claim that a world which includes the things I talked about, such as a massacre in a church in Rwanda in 1994, that would surely be a reductio ad absurdum for the claim that this is indeed the most perfect of all possible worlds. Now, Ben, in terms of animals, I'm glad that he recognizes the problem that his theism presents for the sorry lot of animals in the world. I think that we just need to get our minds around this. He's right that animals the soul building theodicy can't apply to them because they're not moral agents. So animals, they suffer from carnivory, predation, parasitism, extinction, unbelievable sources of suffering. And it seems to me like the one thing he said is, well, maybe animals get compensation in an afterlife. I mean, it seems to me on the one hand, yes, the theist can always add onto their hypothesis, you do have to ask, is this the most plausible thing that we're talking about? I mean, millions and trillions and billions and quadrillions of animals that have existed for the last 300 million years are all going to get a compensatory existence in the afterlife. And of course, there's the justification for this. I mean, if I hit you upside the head and then give you $5 for your trouble, that $5 doesn't justify the fact that I hit you upside the head. So what justifies God in submitting animals to the egregious suffering? It's not just...
All right. We've lost.
Okay, it's not me. It's him.
Yeah. Okay, Randall, we lost you for a second.
Sorry about
Okay.
that.
On the animals and justifying.
Yeah, you were talking about the distinction between compensation and justification.
Yes. Okay. So to compensate somebody does not justify the fact that you inflicted this suffering upon them. So if God is this maximally perfect moral being, for God to inflict that suffering on the animals and then give them an afterlife doesn't justify it. Skeptical theism, it seems to me, is a universal acid, because if God can allow all sorts of inscrutable evils for his maximal good purposes, we don't know that perhaps God is lying to us right now about everything that we experience. Maybe good is evil and evil is good, and God has misled us about that because he has morally sufficient reasons to do so. Now, Ben's opening argument, I think, as well, is a misfire. For one thing, he pits theism against naturalism, but I'm not here to defend naturalism. I'm only here to defend the falsity of theism. So I could reconcile myself in any number of rich metaphysical extravagant frameworks if necessary, just so long as there is no being with the three properties we described and agreed upon: an omnipotent, omniscient, and perfectly good being. It seems to me that to appeal to God in these cases is, as Thomas Nagel said, the idea of God serves as a placeholder for an explanation where something seems to demand explanation and none is available. So yes, we can invoke God as a necessary cause to explain everything else. Well, you could invoke a multiverse if you want to explain the problem of contingency. There's all sorts of possibilities here. And I guess the last thing I really want to emphasize is that the appeal to God in these areas, in terms of the contingency or teleology in the universe, the teleology and contingency, that doesn't actually get you God. At most, all that gets you is a being of sufficient power to create the universe. Maybe even it gets you a being that necessarily exists because of the contingency problem. It doesn't get you, however, a being that is all-knowing, that is morally perfect, and that is all-powerful. And that is the being we're talking about. That is the being that is the only proper object of worship. I don't think that we've seen arguments that support the existence of that being, and thus, at most, we may have a being that has sufficient power to create the universe, maybe give it some design, but also a being that allows the horrendous evils we see in the world around us. So I don't think the case has been made for theism.
All right, thank you for that. So now this will be 30-minute open dialogue, so I'll let you guys take it from here.
Okay, I guess we'll start. Where do I want to start? Okay, we'll start with just where you left off in the last bit on the gap problem. So it seemed to me like you were objecting to my target being metaphysical naturalism. Now, why did I do that? The reason I did that is because I'm also trying to avoid the gap problem. I need to, per hypothesis, put a perfect being on the table and appeal to explanatory considerations about a perfect being. But in order to do that, I need something more substantive on the other side, which is why I chose naturalism, because atheism is a negative claim. It's just saying that there's not some feature of the world. Whereas with naturalism, I can use something like the appeal to the causal closure of the universe. And that would be what I would use to then argue against theism. So in my argument for moral agency, I actually do argue for a perfect being, because I recognize that the deductive argument from contingency is not going to get me there. There is this gap problem. So I need some sort of inference that allows me to get there. So that's why I chose a likelihood evaluation as well for my argument for moral agency. That way I can infer a perfect being from these facts to try to avoid and not have considerations about a priori probabilities. That was the other reason why I chose a likelihood evaluation. So I would just, what do you think of that move as far as trying to avoid the gap problem? And I can see that you're arguing for atheism. I totally concede that in full. But I needed to appeal to the resources of naturalism in my likelihood evaluation in a way that I couldn't have if I only used the concept of atheism.
Yeah, see, I mean, that may be how you had to argue, but of course, the fact that I'm not committed to defending that is still a problem. For example, I'm perfectly happy with amoral Platonism. In fact, I think my whole moral argument really does assume that there's some absolute objective moral disvalue in the universe. That's the most natural way to read it. So it is natural to read that I'm a moral realist of sorts, just that I don't think there is some moral agent who is perfect, him or her or itself, standing behind this. So I think that if you really want the argument to be effective against the position I'm staking out, which is just that there's no being such as God that has these three properties, omniscience, omnipotence, and moral perfection or moral goodness, perfect moral goodness, but is consistent with Platonism or something else, then you'd need to rework the argument to that end. Now, you also, I mean, this is one of the moves you make. You talk about the necessary being a perfect being. And so I'm not quite clear in how we're getting from there is a necessary explanation of the contingent universe to there is this perfect being, the being of perfect being theology, who has a maximal set of compossible great-making properties, as you theologians and theists like to talk about. I mean, how do you get there?
So you can't with the argument from contingency on its own. So I gave that as a deductive argument, and I concede that there is a gap problem here. You cannot deduce God from the necessary being. But what the argument from contingency is getting us thinking is it's a deductive method that leads us to a conclusion that there is something other than the universe that the universe depends on. So it's pointing to something that might be non-natural or supernatural. And so you're right, there's something missing there. We haven't quite gotten to perfect being theism. And so that's why I supplement it with the teleological argument of the argument for moral agency. And I want to say something real quick about that, because you insisted that, you're fine with a moral Platonism. That's fine. This is not a moral argument. The argument is not that there are moral truths and God is standing behind that and making it the case there's moral truths. The argument is that there are moral agents that make decisions in the world. So there is some feature of the world that is best explained by appealing to a perfect being. So I will concede moral Platonism for this entire argument. And it won't make any difference because it's not a moral argument. It is specifically a design argument.
Okay. Could you say something more about your view of animals? Because I think we really have to get our minds around the fact that we're talking about 300 million years and ongoing of literally billions upon billions of animals, some that have suffered unimaginably. We cannot, and there's no option in the vast majority of them for moral development. I mean, I don't know about chimpanzees or dolphins, but the vast majority of animals are not plausibly moral agents. So yes, the only thing it seems you have is a compensation in an afterlife.
Yes.
Is that justified to allow animals to suffer incredibly like this? And human beings, of course, weren't around to witness this, so it's not like it could impact us and our moral development. So the only thing is God's going to give them an afterlife of bliss. Is that justified?
So I think that's a perfectly fair question, and I would first start off by just saying that I don't know. And so I concede that the soul-building theodicy doesn't fit the non-human animal suffering datum very well, which is why I supplemented my theodicy with skeptical theism. And so this is where I would appeal to the cornea principle, the principle that, and use a parent analogy in saying that a child who is undergoing the pain of a vaccine doesn't understand the justification for why that pain is necessary. And so I think we would similarly be in in another situation if we concede my argument for a universal afterlife on the soul building theodicy. That's why I argue for it explicitly. I can't. So I recognize that this is an auxiliary hypothesis that is not entailed by theism nor by the soul building theodicy simpliciter. And so what I would say is that the justification, it probably is not in this life, and that is why we cannot see it. And that epistemic situation would be similar to the child not understanding why they're getting a vaccine. And so that once we make it to this next life, the justification, though we should not be surprised that we do not understand that God justifying reason in this life, but we would understand it in the next. And I recognize that there's a level of ad hocness about this. So I'm doing a likelihood evaluation. So there's the other side of this argument. And so I think this is where the scales, when we look at non-human animal pain, it might tip a little bit favor of argument from evil, but I think the skeptical theist strategy can help blunt that to where the considerations that I mentioned about moral agency in a moral arena tip the scales back in favor of theism.
I wonder how you really do escape from the problem of moral skepticism, though.
Did I mess it up?
I hear both of you guys.
I can't hear anyone. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
I've done something?
Well, I can go ahead and make some brilliant points that Ben can't respond to.
Can y'all hear me now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
I can't hear y'all.
Okay, Ben, I'm going to send him a message to leave and come back.
I do apologize for the technical difficulties, everyone.
Hey, goes with the territory. Technology is great when it works. See, this is actually, I'll kill time while we're waiting for this to be resolved. This is another example of a problem of evil right here. You can hear us?
I can hear you now.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so let's talk about moral
Sorry about that.
skepticism.
I'm not quite sure what happened, but I'm sure I've messed something up.
Well, I will say that kind of evil, so the evil of some technological problem is the kind of evil that I think plausibly could bring about greater goods.
I'm sorry,
Building.
technological evil? What
like the problem of technological challenges on our live stream right now. That's the kind of thing where, like we have to resolve this. Let's figure it out. We have fortitude. We're resourceful. But when we're talking about something like, an entire hundreds of thousands of people being massacred, tortured, right? The absolute heinous things. Those are the kinds of things that it doesn't seem, as I said, this is more like a torture chamber than it is like a gym that is cultivating virtue and nobility in individuals. In so many people, it just breeds hopelessness, bitterness, alienation. And I want to as well add another thing to that, and then maybe you can just respond. So you've talked about how the centrality of this.
It's not me this time,
lost
right?
Randall for a second. Yeah, Randall's frozen, but okay.
Am I back? Okay. What point did I cut out?
So we were talking about the horrendous evils and how they are soul destroying, how people do not get opportunities to cultivate soul building opportunities.
So then I'll just add the other thing is So you've talked about the centrality of this life in preparation for the next life. And the point that I think is a real problem here is the problem of religious ambiguity. In other words, what this perfect being expects of us is not clear at all, because there's no unanimity in the human population. In fact, there's massive disagreement about what this being expects of us, if anything. That is not what you would expect if this were the only opportunity to prepare for right relationship with that being in the next life. It's kind of like if you go to a hotel and all these different people are staying in different hotel rooms. Think of them as analogous to different worldviews or religious perspectives. And each hotel room on the door has a different escape route in case of fire, and they contradict one another. What kind of hotel would allow for this contradictory information in case of fire? And yet that is essentially what this perfect being has given us. Christians fundamentally disagree with Muslims, fundamentally disagree with naturalists, atheists, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons, Jains, Hindus, right? We could spend all day talking about different religious perspectives. That seems to contradict the idea that there is any such being.
So I would once again fall back on the cornea principle here, recalling that the idea behind cornea is that theism predicts God justifying reasons for the evils we observe to not be transparent, but rather obscure. So if there are God justifying reasons for inscrutable evils, then we are unlikely to know what these reasons are because they are mostly beyond human comprehension or beyond our ken. So I would push back on the hotel analogy and say that it's more analogous to the child getting the vaccine and not understanding the justification for why they are getting the vaccine.
There was this terrible case about 15 years ago, a woman named Dina Schlosser. She was a Christian, and she believed that Jesus was telling her to cut the arms off her newborn infant, which she promptly did. And then she called the police. And the police arrived at her house. She was covered in blood. Her infant was lying in the crib dying. And she was singing, "He Touched Me." Now, on your view, your appeal to cornea, it seems perfectly possible that God has some sufficient moral reasons for actually having asked her to sacrifice her child. In fact, that's written into the Judeo-Christian tradition with the story of Abraham. I think, again, that's a sort of reductio for your position, that you can justify any morally heinous action under the precept that maybe, given our relatively limited epistemic access to moral goods, maybe God has some sufficient moral reason for commanding that.
So that might be the case in the sense that this type of skepticism warrants a type of moral skepticism. Can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
Just fine. Okay. Sorry. In that we should be less confident in other certain moral judgments. Now, in the particular case that you described, we're also talking about someone that might have mental deficiencies. And so that would be a datum itself for an unjustified evil. So the question is, this person, if it can be plausibly explained, her actions plausibly explained because of some sort of mental defect, the question for the theist is then, why would these mental defects be justified? And instead of appealing again to the skeptical theist, I'll appeal to the soul building theodicy here, in that it's not all, when it comes to soul building, it's not always about the person that is suffering, but the people importantly related to someone who is suffering. So whereas it may not seem justified for this person to undergo such a mental disorder that would cause them to commit such a heinous act, the people around them, these sorts of evils present them with opportunities for soul building. And in order for them to have the proper kind of go through the proper kind of character development, they have to have these experiences of these sorts of natural evils. So the police officer that came and found, I'm sorry, did you say the woman's name was again? I forgot.
Dina Schlosser.
Yeah, Dina Schlosser. I need to remember that. That's a very common example. Dina Schlosser, this police officer was given an opportunity for character development in very important ways by having to experience this natural evil. And that experience is going to be important for developing character for relationship with God.
So here we're at a picture where God allowed, or in fact commanded or allowed a woman to think, either way, that he wanted her to amputate the arms of her child so that a police officer could grow in his moral development when he came to the scene, which just seems to me, and then to talk, that's an aspect of the most perfect world that one can imagine. That just seems to me extraordinary as a claim. And I think as often as not, perhaps more often than not, that kind of experience would in fact be soul destructive of that individual. He might increasingly suffer trauma, post-traumatic stress disorder, become angry and bitter, alienated and cut off from others around him. You wouldn't see the kind of positive effects in so many of those cases that you are suggesting here. You also talked about, okay, I'm going to move at this point from skeptical theism to soul building. Actually, you don't get to do that. You've already opened the Pandora's box of skeptical theism. You can't put it back in now. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. So it's perfectly possible that God did, in fact, have morally sufficient reasons to allow Dina Schlosser to do this. And in fact, maybe it was a morally good thing. And we just can't perceive that because of our cornea principle, that we have limited epistemic access to God's goods and to the nature of the good and his purposes.
What was the question? Sorry. So you re-outlined cornea. So is it just that this is a reductio ad absurdum and that this is an implausible implication of cornea? I'm sorry.
I'd be happy to go back to the framework of my argument earlier, which is to say there's a key difference between being unable to see how God can be consistent with the existence of evil in the world versus being able to see that he cannot be. And I would submit that in a case like this, it's pretty clear, in fact, that a perfect being such as you've wanted to defend is not consistent with the kind of states of affairs of a world which involves a mother amputating the arms of her child as a devotional act.
So would you say that moral judgment is come about by deducing it from sound moral principles?
I think that it begins with a basic moral perception about states of affairs, good and evil, that we contemplate certain things. Then you can reason from those intuitive starting points. You can reason to a principle such as a utilitarian principle or a deontological principle, but I would submit that the basic moral intuition is always going to be more fundamental and epistemically well entrenched than any derivative principle you would draw from it.
No, that's fair. That's fair enough. Skeptical theism is often formulated in consequentialist terms, or at least using consequentialist language and concepts, because the idea is that there might be some greater good, that some inscrutable evil is somehow logically connected to. But what about a deontologically important reason? So the idea here is that God might have made some sort of promise in that he would not intervene in certain ways, and that this promise is beyond our ken and is deontologically important. So I think that's one consideration to take in mind, is that we just aren't in that position to understand. And the other thing that I would say about the suffering that we for soul building is that it's not just limited to the soul building of, say, the police officer that came to the event. So there are going to be other ways in which this suffering is related to other souls that need developing in other very important ways. And so it could be justified in the sense that this person's suffering, if we're now moving back to these consequentialist terms, their suffering is justified because um, because so many people's lives will come to develop character. I'm thinking of like a utilitarian calculus right here. Because so many people's character will be developed, and that will bring so many people into relationship with God. And this is the best of all possible worlds. That suffering might be the only way for that most people to come to relationship with God. So these are two different ways that I would approach um, your objection right here. And to say something about, well, it's a Pandora's box, and you don't get to do that because once we've opened the Pandora's box, you can't put it back in. I'm using these two different methods to hopefully climb the same mountain from different sides, to hopefully come at the same conclusion. So whereas we might be able to understand some sort of justification in this life, I'm using skeptical theism to hike the other side of this mountain to say, but we might be very well in the dark about the justifications that are present in the next life.
I could enumerate a few more examples. I'll just give one more.
Sure.
December 26, 2004. Tsunami spreads out across the Indian Ocean as a result of an earthquake, and 228,000 plus people are drowned in the ocean. And the claim is, well, God had to, the only way that the most perfect world could achieve the kind of maximal soul building is for God to have precisely those 228,000 plus people be washed into the ocean. As I conceded in my opening presentation, that's always possible. What we have to ask is what is most plausible. Is it most plausible that the world as we describe it and as we saw it on that day, December 26, 2004, that world is the product of a providential being preparing us for a soul-building eternity, or that it is just a random world in which poop happens and there's no overriding guiding intelligence behind it all? It seems to me the latter. Now, often one of the legitimate points folks like myself make against theodicies is that, if anything, theodicies, they actually add to the evil in the world. And I would submit that what we have to do in this case is really think about the implications of your endorsement of utilitarianism. Because if utility of this kind can be used to justify any heinous action on behalf of a morally perfect being, then by implication, any heinous action could be justified by a morally finite being if we had reasonable belief that some greater good could come out of that heinous action. Any form of rape or torture or anything else you can imagine could be justified because, hey, God achieves greater goods through the suffering of creatures all the time. We could do so as well. And I think that would be a morally disastrous position to take, but it seems to me an implication of your position.
So I would push back on the last thing you just said, because I presented the soul building theodicy in the terms of the consequentialism, whereas I put out the possibility of skeptical theism for a non-deontological reason. There might be some promise that God has made that is beyond our ken and we just could not understand. So I'm not sure it's committed to the consequentialism. These are, I personally think of consequentialism and deontological methods as climbing the same mountain from different sides. I don't think that there's a deep tension between these sort of things. So I would try to resist the implications. But now to what you were saying about the tsunami, in that, what was the figure? It's greater than 200,000. It's a big number.
Yeah.
That yes, this is that if our attention is not on the theodicy and the argument from moral agency in the sense of thinking of a moral arena where there's character development going on, it is implausible. And so that's why I have to argue, I think, explicitly for a universalism, an afterlife that is available to all. Otherwise, there just might not be any way out of this problem. Similarly, if you believe what happens to us is more important than how we respond to events in our life, then there might not be any way out of this. But if we think that how we respond is in this life is more important than what happens to us, and we put a universal afterlife on the table, then I think in that likelihood evaluation, we can push the scales back up in favor of theism.
I'd like to come back to your cosmological argument. We haven't given it a lot of attention, but it certainly deserves it. So
it's Josh Rasmussen's, not mine. I have to.
Sure. Okay. You know what? There's nothing new under the sun. So
yeah.
What I'm thinking is why do we need a necessary? I mean, we need, first of all, do we need something necessary? Could we have a finite regress of contingent causes that just goes back forever? That's my first question. The second one is, if we do need a necessary principle to explain it, do we need a personal one? Why can't we have an impersonal one? To talk about the fine tuning that you talked about later, why not just a multiverse, right? A multiverse that just exists of necessity. That's the one necessary thing, and we just happen to be a little tiny bit of it. To my mind, that seems to fit better with the actual facts of the randomness of evil and suffering in the world than a providential personal God.
So it might. So again, with the argument from contingency, the thing that I wanted to center the argument around is the question of why is there something rather than nothing. And I do not even pretend to claim to have the last word on this question. This is probably one of the deepest, most sublime questions that we could ask. But the argument from contingency is one answer to that. And so why did I include it? Why didn't I just stay with the argument for moral agency? And, because this argument for contingency leaves me vulnerable to the gap problem that we mentioned earlier. Why include it? So the reason that I want to include it is, one, is because it goes with this really deep question. So if we accept the argument from contingency, there is no longer a mystery of existence, in that we have an answer to the question why there is something rather than nothing, why this something rather than something else. And so what I want it to do is to get us thinking in deductively important ways, that we can think of the universe in a way that it could depend on something other than itself, and that it could point to something non-natural or supernatural. Now, perhaps it doesn't point to anything like that. Perhaps there is some necessary foundation of the universe that is itself natural, like a multiverse, like you said. These are the different views on the table, which is that's why I supplement this argument with the argument for moral agency. I want us to be thinking about everything. When we say why is there something, I want us to be thinking about the totality of things in the world, and how that big conjunctive fact could require something other than it's anything within that set of contingent things. And so this is taking the basically the strategy is that there's some fact about the universe that, when applied with some principle out the universe, makes it the case that the universe depends on something other than itself. And so that's really the main reasoning that I want us to take away from the argument from contingency, so that it's then pointing us in the direction of possibly something supernatural.
Pointing us in the direction of possibly something supernatural does not get us to a perfect being. So
absolutely not. I've already conceded the gap.
Yeah, so it seems like we only have the bridge built part way over the canyon at that point. You talked about the principle of sufficient reason, of course, as a part of your contingency argument. But you also talked later on about, as moral agents, that we would have libertarian free will. So, I mean, if there is a sufficient reason to explain every event, then is there not a sufficient reason to explain why I choose to have vanilla rather than chocolate ice cream, in which case I'm not free to choose vanilla rather than chocolate, but it's determined by the sufficient reason?
I'm sorry, you're going to have to, that was really fast.
Okay, so the principle of sufficient reason says that for every event, there is
Yeah.
or state of affairs, there is a sufficient reason to explain why that event or state of affairs and not another one. And libertarian free will requires the ability that I have an action of indifference, that I could choose A or not A. But if there is a sufficient reason for every event, then there's a sufficient reason to explain why I chose A rather than not A, in which case it would seem that I cannot be libertarianly free to choose A rather than not A because it's determined.
So it seems here, to answer this objection, I'd have to appeal to the concept of agent causation, in the sense that our choices, our free choices, are the sufficient reason for why we choose something rather than something else. But this does imply an ability, this sense of could have done otherwise, if we're saying ought implies can, does imply the ability to break the laws of nature. And so that can seem implausible. So this is a datum that I'm using, but I also recognize that this is a controversial datum. It's something that is going to require further argument, in the sense that I would have to defend that moral agency does imply libertarian free will and this concept of agent causation.
Well, let's go one more minute, guys, because we had technical problems. We're a little bit over, so why don't we wrap this up as the last topic?
Yeah, I mean, we can stop now if you want.
Oh, okay. Well, I didn't know if you had one more response, Randall, to that, or.
Well, I would just say it's.
I went first, so you wrap it up.
Sure. Okay, so on this point, it seems to me, in terms of sufficient reason, that you could say, well, yes, the fact that I chose vanilla rather than chocolate is just the sufficient reason for the events of my having chosen vanilla rather than chocolate. But that seems actually to turn me into an unmoved mover of sorts, that I generate the reason itself, which means there is no sufficient reason apart from my willing, which seems to violate the principle of sufficient reason, which says that there is some sufficient reason for everything, including why I ultimately chose vanilla rather than chocolate. It seems to make it indifferent that I could have chosen chocolate, but if there is sufficient reason, I could not have chosen chocolate. So, but that's a footnote anyway. It's not somewhat secondary to the larger.
Free will is a rabbit hole, and if you let us go, I'll talk about it all night.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for that great discussion. So, we're going to do our debrief now, where you guys are going to. Okay. So, Ben, why don't you go first and give your thoughts overall from your actual perspective.
So first off, I want to say thanks to Dr. Rauser for doing this. I've gone through a lot of his work, so the opportunity to be able to come here and do a devil's advocate style debate is really, this is a project that I've been wanting to do for a really long time. So the fact that I was able to do it with Randall is just awesome. And so I thought that it went really good. I was hesitant to use skeptical theism in my presentation tonight, but I am glad that I did. I think that Randall and I were able to really have some really good exchanges in the relationship between the argument from evil and then the contrast between this skeptical strategy, the skeptical theism, and then the soul building theodicy. So what I think is one of his strongest points tonight, one that I would very much agree with, is that there is this problem with skeptical theism of a Pandora's box of once you open it up, there's this, it's hard to put everything back in. There's things like modal skepticism or moral skepticism, and so when you go back and watch the exchange, it's certainly the area where I think, on reflection, I struggled the most, because there's really no good way to argue the things back in the box. I don't know what you'd want to say on there.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm delighted to have participated as well, and I admire Ben, and you're certainly doing a lot with real atheology to raise the level of discourse. It's we could all use more of that. So I love your dispassionate and rational approach to these questions. and you've done your homework, so I thought it was great. On this particular issue, I wrestle with it a little bit. I mean, I appeal to skeptical theism. What I try to do is argue that we do have moral knowledge, and I have a credulity principle that I always follow, which is that you accept the deliverances of your cognitive faculties generally across the board unless you have some reason to doubt them. And that really comes back to the influence of Thomas Reid, the 18th century philosopher, on my own thinking, by way of Nicholas Wolderstorff in particular. And I was doing my doctorate 20 years ago.
Is that how you pronounce his name? I've definitely been pronouncing it wrong.
Which one?
Wolderstorff, or
Wolderstorff.
Wolderstorff. Okay.
Yeah, Wolderstorff. Yeah.
I'm acting like I'm going to write down that pronunciation. I don't know.
If you ever have a question, like find a YouTube video in which people are talking about him or something.
Yeah, you're right.
But so what I do is I start off, we have this wealth of moral knowledge, but we also recognize that we are fallible agents. So we can be wrong about moral knowledge as well as anything else. But I don't adopt a skeptical position until you give me some additional reason to question my knowledge in this case. And so then hopefully you can say, so there could be additional reasons why God allows something without allowing for an ontological, or skeptical, I should say, explosion, where just everything is now doubted, because I still have a general credulity principle that accepts the deliverances of my cognitive faculties unless I have a reason to doubt them. So I don't know, maybe that works, maybe it doesn't, but that's certainly the way I try to strike a balance on that. Because you have to be careful, right? It is, skeptical theism can become like the alien blood in the movie Aliens. It just burns through everything unless you're careful.
Yeah. So with the argument from contingency, I definitely sidestepped it. It was the infinite regress objection. It was, how do you rule out that the universe doesn't depend on an infinite regress of contingent things? And so I would say that's the objection that I would struggle with the most. So I'm not the biggest fan of cosmological arguments, but that changed with this argument from contingency. I'm not a fan of causal cosmological arguments. I very much like this argument from contingency. But where do you stand on that infinite regress problem? That's, to me, I don't know how to rule it out. I'm not convinced by something like Hilbert's Hotel. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I mean, so I think on the one hand, we often find that people have conflicting intuitions as to what seems to them more incredible. Some people find it more incredible to appeal to a necessary being, because they say, hey, if we can explain everything by just having one kind of being, which is contingency all the way down, and it just goes back forever, I'd rather have an infinite regress of contingent entities than to have to work all back to one necessary thing, because that's a completely new kind of thing. I've met people who think in those terms. Of course, the standard rejoinder is that, well, like an infinite regress of contingent things doesn't explain anything. So to use the train analogy, where you pull up to a train stop and then you see the boxcars rushing by, and if someone were to claim, well, there is no train pulling that whole train, there's just infinite number of boxcars in every direction. The first problem of that, of course, the trivial problem is that there's no such train in our world. But of course, in terms of analogy, you'd be inclined to think, yeah, but there must be something pulling it, right? It can't just be boxcars forever each way. So that there does have to be a start, a necessary thing. And I think that time and again, that attraction to the necessary is attractive to people, and it does make sense to me. But I recognize that some people can say, it just seems to me more plausible that there's an infinite regress of contingent things. And I'm a little reluctant about saying like they're irrational to conclude that. I think that all things being equal, it's a reasonable position for them to take if they think hard about it, and it seems the most plausible view.
Those were the two things I had on my for reflections. What did you have on your list for out of character reflections?
I mean, the one thing I didn't do in mine was to lay out an actual argument for the problem of evil. because of one reason is because we're so familiar with the logical form of those arguments, whether they are a logical or an evidential probabilistic form. But another thing was, I really think that in my experience, you have these two different intuitions. That some people think, I just can't see maybe how God could have a reason to allow that, but I know there must be one, versus other people who are just impacted by the evil and suffering in the world and conclude, no, there can't be a reason. This is just definitively makes the concept of God implausible. And so I wanted to really kind of focus on articulating the difference between those two intuitions.
Gotcha.
So I think very often we come to these arguments with a basic intuitive sense as to what the right answer is, and then we kind of almost confabulate an argument afterwards to confirm our intuitions. And so rather than focus on the argument, I wanted just to get down to distilling the intuitions and then just try to win the audience over to my intuition. Another general observation is that there's a interesting kind of ethical challenge with these kinds of exercises, insofar as, you know, a person believes my convictions are true and important, and then I have to be careful that I'm not too good at doing the other side, because I could lead people away from beliefs that I consider to be true and important. So what happens if theism is true, Christianity is true, I'm resurrected into eternity, and God points out 18 people that became atheists because of this debate and then never came back again? The only thing I can say, well, one thing I can say at that point is I think that there is always a risk in steel manning your opponent, right? Or the positions that are contrary to yours. But I nonetheless think it's an ethical obligation, because this is one place I think where utilitarianism is weak generally as a philosophy or an ethic, because you can never calculate all the possible implications of a particular action. I think often what you just have to do is focus on the principle. And here, the principle, I think, is the principle of the do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If I would want other people to steel man my views, or views that are familiar or friendly to theism or Christianity, I should want to do the same thing to others. And then I just can't worry about all the possible implications that might have on different people. And so I think that we've done that tonight. I think that it was a very successful exchange. And often, one last thing, because these things can become so heated and partisan, I think it's always good to have this kind of exercise so we don't take ourselves too seriously. So I'm happy to have been a part of this. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. So,
Yeah, thanks so much for coming on, guys. I'd be happy to have you on again sometime. There are a few
Absolutely.
questions in the Q&A, not a ton, but if we can just respond to them
sure.
real quick. So, okay, let's see. Resonance Q&A asks, can atheism explain the reason for evil and suffering, or can it justify evil and suffering in a no-God universe?
So when you say, can it justify evil? So there's two ways I can can we are certain evil acts justified even if there is no God? And one easy way to is to use the dentist example, the intrinsic good, extrinsic good, or instrumental good, in that it might be justified for an evil if it's for some compensating good. But I think more along the lines what is being asked is it's saying can it make sense of why there is evil in the world? And I don't think so. This is why I use the target of naturalism, because I think that if you're going to explain something like evil, you're going to have to appeal to something that has positive content. Whereas atheism as a thesis is purely negative content. So you would need something like a hypothesis of indifference, where you would say that the evils that we observe are explained by the fact that the universe is indifferent to the nature and the condition of suffering in the universe is neither the result of malevolent or benevolent actions by disembodied persons. Randall, if you want to, I was kind of rambling there.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, I think that it fits evil and suffering. Well, suffering certainly fits with atheism. Evil is something else, because to have evil, you actually have to have a richer framework, because suffering could be a non-moral thing. But once you have evil, there you have to have a sort of framework to explain the existence of evil, and that might require something like a moral ontology that is Platonic or something else. So naturalism, I think, would have, as an example, would have a bigger problem with evil than with suffering, because they are two different things. Although suffering is evil, but but you could also have possibly a state of affairs in which there is no good and evil objectively. There is only suffering and pleasure. And that would maybe the universe ultimately is non-moral in that sense. So I'd want to distinguish between those two. I do think that the sort of randomness that we see about suffering and evil, and particularly the big problem of natural evil in 300 million years of animal suffering.
Oh, dang.
I think we lost Randall. Okay. We'll wait. Well.
Okay, there we are.
Yeah, so you're saying animal
cut out
suffering.
Non-human animal pain.
Yeah, so
300 million years.
Yeah, so that's that is certainly something that is a problem for theism, right? Particularly when you're talking about that kind of like duration. So I think one thing, like the soul-making stuff is one thing, but when you have non-moral agents, that's... And so I'm glad that you addressed that out of the gate. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. So the soul building theodicy is my favorite theodicy, but I mean, that's obviously like the places where it's weakest are obviously horrendous evils and non-human animal pain. And so I figured you got to say something out of the gate about both of those.
All right, then the next question kind of relates. How is pain understood in the absence of a moral framework, especially in the animal kingdom? I'm not sure I totally follow this question, but maybe they're asking like how the problem of evil pertains to the animal kingdom when animals aren't moral agents, something like that.
Yeah, so I would again appeal to the distinction that I made in my presentation between moral agents and moral patients. So it might be the case that, but he says in the absence of a moral framework. So moral agents and moral patients assume a moral framework. So I don't know. I don't know how to answer this. Randall, help me.
Yeah, because that's sort of, it can be interpreted different ways. It could be,
Yeah.
I'm guessing it might be, if there's no objective moral good and evil, then what is the significance of pain? I'm not sure. But that's
Maybe
one
it's,
possibility.
The example that's often used, if we kill someone, we've murdered someone, but if a lion kills a zebra, that, the lion hasn't murdered the zebra. So in that sense, there's no framework. And so how would you understand pain? Just, I guess, in scientific terms at that point.
Oh, is the moral framework applicable to animals? Here we go.
The moral framework. So with that, when we're not talking about moral agents, the concept of a moral framework doesn't have any purchase, because you're not talking about a rational animal that can respond to reason. So no, it's not applicable to animals. Hopefully that answers the question.
But there is an interesting question as to whether any non-human species can develop some degree of moral agency. So I kind of briefly alluded to that with respect to chimpanzees and so on. I think sometimes we've been a little dismissive of that possibility because of kind of a sort of speciesist assumption. So that's an open question. I'm not entirely sure. I do think that we often anthropomorphize animals like dogs, right?
For sure. No.
Okay. Well, I'll give him a second. Okay. Are we back, Randall?
Yeah.
Okay, we heard you say dogs and then you cut out.
Yeah, so dogs
We anthropomorphize
Yeah,
dogs.
we
Certainly.
anthropomorphize dogs. We project human emotions and intentions and thoughts onto them. And
Okay. Well, he can follow up on that. Okay, here he is.
sure.
Okay, unless you had something else, I'm going to go next one. So, does the falsifiability of the resurrection demonstrate the supernatural power of God? The Jewish chief priests and Pharisees had the most to gain. I think he meant by saying squashing that Christ was risen.
I did not defend anything uniquely Christian tonight, so I will let Randall take this one.
I'm not sure what this person's Gavin is asking here. So the resurrection is a falsifiable hypothesis. You know, Paul talks about that explicitly in 1 Corinthians 15. It is always possible to, in principle, provide the bones of Jesus for something else and show that he did not, in fact, rise. I don't think that the fact that it is falsifiable is required for it to be justified. Like some people think the falsification criterion that is often used in Popperian science is somehow a general requirement for rational belief, and I don't think that's the case. But I do think the resurrection is in principle falsifiable.
So I want to say that I reject falsifiability. I don't think that it is a satisfactory solution to what's called in the philosophy of science the demarcation problem, which is basically the question of what is science and what is not. And so I don't think falsifiability gets. I think it's a very important piece of philosophical history that is important to study and is certainly.
I'm not a big fan of it either. I mean, I think
the methodology, I get it.
Modify a hypothesis in order to save it from falsification. So it's not a helpful criterion, I think.
And so I think that where falsifiability becomes useful. So my profession is engineering. So if I'm creating some sort of test and I'm looking for some sort of, like, if I then put in criteria of falsification, that makes my experiment more robust. That's where I think that falsifiability becomes useful. But as a philosophical principle that solves the demarcation problem, I don't think it gets us there.
Mm-hmm.
Not philosophy of religion, but definitely interesting.
Non-alchemists ask, how would each person steelman Platonism, specifically that there could be moral facts independent of an ultimate mind? So I know, Randall, you had touched on that some, but...
Well, I'd be happy to steelman it. So I think, first of all, you could just say, one thing you could say to steelman Platonism over against theism is to say that it's simpler just to have these facts, these objective universals, abstract objects that exist on their own, rather than to invoke an additional being, God, in order to explain the ground of them. Further, you could say that when theists try to identify universals or abstract objects, as in Platonism, with the divine mind, it's really not an explanation or a satisfactory one. You're doing an analogy between human ideas and human minds and what you call divine ideas and the divine mind, but it doesn't actually explain anything because you still have these necessarily existent entities. So what does it add that there is now another entity, God, that somehow thinks them? Because they still exist. If they exist of necessity, they don't need God to be their ontological ground. So it's not a helpful explanation. You could just have the Platonism without adding God into the picture.
So I would steelman it by appealing to something similar to what has been called the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument, saying that basically these sorts of arguments appeal to non-moral truths that would be abstract and universal. And so mathematics is a good example. Non-moral normativity would be another. So I might, to try to steelman it, I might say something like, it is a abstract, universal, logical truth that we should, ought, or must accept the arguments of valid arguments with true premises. And so, if that truth is indispensable to how we understand knowledge, um, then that would imply a form of Platonism. If we were, had this very strict correspondence theory of truth, in that um, propositions are true. What makes propositions true is how they correspond to some ontologically weighty portion of reality. So that's how I'd go about steel manning the Platonic position.
All right. That was the remainder of our questions. So that's it. Unless you guys have anything else that you want to add.
I just very much enjoyed it, and I certainly look forward to doing this kind of thing again, because I think, again, it's everybody's a winner with this kind of thing, because if we win, we win, and if we lose, we win. So, hey.
Yeah, I want to echo what Randall just said. I've really looked forward to doing a project like this, and I like to think that I've put a good bit of work into this one, and that the fruits of that work will be apparent in this exchange, and that I hope theists and atheists alike will be able to watch it and take constructive forms of thought from it, and help them incorporate it in their own thinking, both of how they think about their position and how they think about other people's positions.
Yeah. Okay. We got one more question. If you guys, this will be the last question for the chat. So Ben said that he's not convinced with, I guess, seeing the Kalam cosmological argument. What's his objection? He did talk about infinite regress. Isn't that strong enough to reject the notion the universe always existed? So I think they're referring more to the contingency argument, but
so I'll take this one. So the Kalam cosmological argument appeals to causation. So the first premise, whatever begins to exist has a cause. That's a causal premise. And so it might seem like it's not controversial because it seems intuitive. But in reality, that causal principle assumes something like a tenseless theory of time, which is something that has open questions about it. It assumes that this kind of principle is something that can be applied to something like a cosmic singularity or the beginning of the universe or something like that. So there's a lot of question marks in this cosmological argument, whereas with the argument from contingency, my first premise was that the universe is contingent. So I think that the plausibility of those first premises are much stronger. Now, the second premise is that the universe began to exist in the Kalam. Again, this might seem like it's just non-controversial because there's a lot of cosmologists who would say something similar. But again, it assumes that tenseless theory of time. And there is a question mark about whether there was a first moment of time or about whether there was this cosmic beginning. Whereas in the second premise of the argument from contingency, I'm appealing to the PSR. I'm appealing to the principle of sufficient reason, which I think might be less controversial. I'm certainly more sympathetic to something like a PSR. So when I put these arguments side by side, I find that the Kalam cosmological argument has a lot more places it can be attacked, whereas the argument from contingency just doesn't have as many places to be attacked from. And I think for me, I think that's a strength of the argument from contingency over the Kalam cosmological. It's why I don't like. I'm not a big fan of cosmological arguments for this reason.
Yeah, I could add a word on the second premise of the Kalam cosmological argument, the universe began to exist. Of course, when Bill Craig argues that, he argues both from empirically from cosmology, but he also presents two a priori arguments. So the one that you cannot traverse an actual infinite series, and the other one that an actual infinite series is contradictory. And so that could apply to this idea of an infinite regress. If you thought about an infinite regress of causes as being a sequence over time or something, then you could never traverse it if you accepted that premise. And in terms of just the contradictory nature of an actual infinite set, then that would be a problem. But I'm not persuaded. I think Ben said he's not persuaded. I'm not persuaded by Craig's a priori argument for the second premise. It seems to me that because I am a Platonist about numbers and other things, I do believe that there's an infinite number of abstract objects. And so even though it seems paradoxical to us, and you do get things, Ben referenced, like Hilbert's Hotel, that lead to paradoxical conclusions, I'm okay with that. So,
Man, this was a good conversation. Jeez, we touched on so much.
we sure did. Yeah.
All right. Well, yeah, I appreciate you guys a ton for coming on and for the audience for interacting. We'll go ahead and call it a night there. Thanks.
All right.